Hey, what up everybody, this is Steve Breach coming to you with the 10th episode of Monday Night War. This was on Goldberg entitled, Who's Next? Honestly, in my mind, as a wrestling fan, through the late 90s and the early 2000s, WCW and WWE's Monday Night War, where basically you were, having to hold the remote in your hand for the complete 2 hours and flip back and forth and making sure that you weren't missing anything in professional wrestling. There was no Twitter, there was no Facebook, there was no anything else. Basically, you just had to rely on that remote, and anytime you really felt like what was going on one channel was all right to change the channel, you'd flip over and see what the other guys were doing. Out of this time in wrestling, it was easily, in my time of being a wrestling fan, it was the peak of wrestling. This was like you could go to the store and you would run into somebody in produce and they'd be wearing a wrestling shirt. It was just easy to start a conversation with those people. You worked with people. I went to school with people. It was a huge time to be a wrestling fan. And out of that time, there was the NWO, and there was Goldberg, Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock, DX. There was a few things at the top of the list that were the biggest things of those times. Goldberg, easily in my mind, is one of the biggest stars to ever come out of professional wrestling. And then once you get to there, it's debatable on if he deserved to be there, or what got him there, and all sorts of things that you can break down, and even you can even try to think about if Goldberg was a guy that really and I don't want to say took for granted for what he had, but maybe I don't know, for me as a wrestling fan, I don't think Goldberg ever really, I don't think he really liked being a wrestler. I think it was well established that basically he was a very good college football player at the University of Georgia. He was drafted by the Los Angeles Rams. I'm not sure if it was storyline or not, but they would bring it up in WCW that he was roommates with Kevin Green at that point, and then they worked a tag match together in WCW once he sort of was coming up as a star, and then from there. Just basically he wasn't able to hack it as a professional football player. At one time he was playing in a semi-pro league here in Sacramento on the Sacramento Surge. I honestly at the time didn't know Bill Goldberg was on the team, but they produced trading cards of him when he played here, and they became really popular as Goldberg grew in popularity. These cards were popping up, and they were going for a lot of money because of how popular Bill Goldberg was. That was how I knew or remembered that he played here in Sacramento on the Sacramento Surge at one point. I've never heard him comment on anything about being in Sacramento, but probably knowing Goldberg, he probably hated it. Basically he fell back on hard times. Basically his accountant called him up and said, you need to figure out what you're going to be doing with your next part of your life, because as of right now, you're running out of money. So basically he called up and got a hold of Eric Bischoff because he worked out at Sting and Lex Luger's gym, said he wanted to go into professional wrestling, but said he didn't want to be one of those job guys. Basically, he wanted to be somebody who made a difference. And WCW saw him as a diamond in the rough. He went through the power plant when he was signed as a developmental wrestler. Something that the power plant is something that I think Goldberg is one of the only guys I know of that really has good things to say about it. Well, him and Diamond Dallas Page are the two guys that really say good things about it. They always had a ton of wrestlers there. I've always thought that the power plant, honestly, was a little bit more of a money maker than it was a star maker. Batista has had very, very bad things to say about going to the power plant and them basically running him out of town, saying that he would never make it as a professional wrestler. And Batista would later on, find his way to WWE and become one of the biggest stars ever in professional wrestling. I'm gonna skip around in here a lot bit because I think everybody knows a lot about Goldberg. If not, go pick up that Goldberg. I can't remember what it was called. The Definitive Collection. It had some name that came out earlier this year, or maybe it was last year. And it's got all of the best Goldberg matches on there. If you buy it on the Blu-ray, I'm not sure if it's like this on the DVD, but on the Blu-ray, disc 1 is all WCW, and on the Disc 2 is all WWE stuff. But honestly, in my mind, they sort of put Goldberg as the savior of WCW. He was the guy that emerged. He was one of the only people you can point at that WCW created as a star and brought up to main event status. A lot of guys that had a long life in professional wrestling, like Chavo Guerrero and Chris Jericho, guys like that, they found a niche in WCW and exposed it until they got to the point of being able to leave and go to WWE. From there, WWE got behind them with the big machine and were able to push these guys to be big, huge stars. Chavo, of course, being a big-time cruiserweight, and who can forget ECW champion. Chris Jericho would go on to be a world heavyweight and WWE champion. Of course, one of the biggest stars in wrestling today. Everybody always loves Jericho. But WCW had a lot of bad points. And in my mind, Goldberg was at this point of them, as Paul Heyman said it, there was a lot of guys working for WCW at the point that were so consumed with not blowing it that they blew it. And there was a lot of things about during, Goldberg's big run that, they didn't really expose Goldberg a whole bunch, to say how much of a big deal he was. Of course, when they did big shows and everybody would be chanting his name and you were watching on TV, you would see that people were behind him. But as this guy would make personal appearances, WCW was at the point of never being behind him. I can remember, if you watch the documentary that they put out today, they had to show footage Bill Goldberg at a NASCAR race, and at the bottom, you could tell from the bottom of the screen, it said courtesy of NASCAR, that it was all shot by NASCAR. Nothing was shot by WCW because they would never send a camera crew to follow this guy around to show the big things that he was doing. WWE, it doesn't matter if they're out doing tribute for the troops, if they're out doing Make-A-Wish, if they're out, at a professional football game or professional baseball game. Anytime people are going to be rubbing shoulders with other stars, anything that they could use to make them look bigger, they always shoot it and they always air it. This was, this footage that WWE had to search out of Goldberg going to a NASCAR race, saying, "Start your engines," basically being part of the celebration, squirting the champagne bottle after the race was over. They didn't do this stuff. 1998, one of the biggest times in baseball to be a big baseball fan. Sammy Sosa and Mark McGwire both chasing after the home run record. When they were in St. Louis, Bill Goldberg went to the Cardinals game to meet Mark McGwire. Mark McGwire, one of the best home run hitters of all time, one of the biggest guys that people point fingers at for the steroids. In 1998, he broke Roger Maris's record of the home run deal. And when Mark McGwire met Goldberg, they did sort of a deal where Mark McGwire took his bat and he rubbed it on Goldberg's chest for good luck. And that night in that game, Mark McGwire hit one of those record-breaking home runs. WCW never played up on this. Basically, you had to hear about this basically through internet, web pages, the same things that we go to today. You had to read about it in the Observer, or you had to see it with Major League Baseball talking about it. It just never made sense that WCW would never try to get behind them and trying to make them seem like they were a bigger deal. It never really made sense. Two of the biggest Monday Nitros that they ever did, I was lucky enough to be a part of, and the Georgia Dome in Atlanta seemed like it was the home of Atlanta. Because of WCW being based as a Turner product. They had their offices in a subdivision of Atlanta, Georgia. So when they started going to the Georgia Dome, where the Atlanta Falcons play football still to this day, it was a really, really big deal. The first time they ever ran one of these shows was in January of 1998. They had 26,000 fans at this show. And I remember being in Atlanta. This is when I was still in high school, and I didn't have a car yet at this point, so I wasn't able to go to this show. My mom and my stepdad, they didn't really endorse me being a wrestling fan. They sort of both looked down on it a little bit, and neither of them I knew were going to take me to the show even if I asked, because it was a Monday, it was a school night, and they were kind of strict on that shit. But July 6, 1998. This was my junior going into senior year. I can honestly remember this night as the night that Goldberg beat Hogan. I also remember this as the night that I sort of just said, fuck it, I'm going to the show. I didn't tell my mom because I didn't want her to know, and I just said, I'm going to get home whenever I get home, and whatever happens, happens. This is going to be worth it. 41,000 fans. And Tony Schiavone and everybody that talked about it was right. This was WCW's WrestleMania. This was something that was a big deal. And Goldberg hyped it up even more than I've never thought about it. This match wasn't even announced until Thursday. The Thursday before. They had talked about, Hogan versus Goldberg was going to happen on the show, but it was only supposed to be a dark match. And Bischoff tells the story as Hogan called Bischoff and said, hey, we got to go and we got to put the title on Goldberg. I think this is going to be a big deal. And of course, there's the backstory of basically Hogan was saying, he can beat me, but there's a little asterisk on there that I want to be the guy that beats him down the road. I want to be that guy that ends Goldberg's streak. And, they sort of had to go along with that plan because that was the only deal that they had to make it a big deal. I remember that night, that it was loud in there. That was Goldberg's home stadium. Everybody knew that Goldberg was a Georgia boy that went to the University of Georgia. He had played for the Atlanta Falcons, so there was a lot of history built up with him in there, and they were loud. I mean, I felt like I was one of the only people in that place chanting for Hollywood Hogan to get the win that night. I knew it wasn't going to happen, but I just couldn't root for Goldberg because how big of a Hulk Hogan mark I was, even in that sort of a setting. I've always hated the fact that it wasn't a one-on-one match, and because it involves the NWO. It involved Karl Malone and Diamond Dallas Page. But when Goldberg, won the belt that night, it blew the roof off the place, and that was huge. 41,000 fans. They would always run shows in January and July, the 2 J months. It was sort of like built up as being like every 6 months they would go through the Georgia Dome. They came back to the Georgia Dome another time, and they really weren't setting up anything. This was right after Goldberg had lost to Nash thanks to the Scott Hall taser, and I think they were building up to the fact that they were going to do a rematch, Kevin Nash against Goldberg. But then they did the gimmick where Goldberg was arrested for stalking Miss Elizabeth. It was sort of like a rape thing, but they never said rape. And then because of him not being there, they ended up doing Kevin Nash against Hogan, which ended up being the finger poke of doom, which a lot of people hated. And it wasn't as big as the first time that they did the Georgia Dome with Hogan versus Goldberg with 41,000. They still did 38,000, but that's still a really respectful number for doing the Georgia Dome. And the first time that they did that show, I mean, people were sitting behind the Titantron. People were sitting behind the curtains. It wasn't like the WrestleMania setup where it was the whole freaking Georgia Dome. It was basically like, where the 45 or 50-yard line is on a football field. They curtained it off to where it was only half of the stadium, and people were sitting way in the back that they could only hear it. But because of the finger poke of doom, and everybody hated that, you dropped from 38,000 to only 25,000, and that would be the last time WCW ever ran the Georgia Dome. From there, they would go on to use the Phillips Arena, where the Hawks play, a basketball arena. It was new, and it was nice, but they just knew that it was too big to go back to the Dome. And from there, WWF started running it, and the first time they did it was 34,000. So I mean, they had almost 10,000 more people than what WCW had. But Goldberg's always going to go down as one of those wonders. I sort of liked the fact that they didn't talk about his WWE stuff in this. It was just on the WCW stuff because they were really focusing on the wars. But there was a lot of backhanded compliments in this thing. Bret Hart basically saying that he was never a wrestler. They talked about the William Regal match, which I believe was on Thunder, where basically they just exposed Goldberg for not being a wrestler, and I don't think they really told the story the way that I've always heard the story. I've always heard that it was Regal that went out there on his own to shoot on Goldberg, because Regal was looking for a spot for his own, and they weren't giving it to him, so basically I think that ended up getting Regal fired from WCW. But this is a really, really good show. As always, this is the 10th installment of the Monday Night Wars with the Goldberg episode. Make sure you go out of your way to check this out, because it honestly was a really, really good one, and you'll really enjoy it. Goldberg's not one of my favorite guys, but I love reliving these things. This is one of the best things that WWE's ever done is this Monday Night War series. Excellent. 2 thumbs up. All stars all around. Peace out, everybody.